No Tokens, Electric Literature, A Public Space, Split Lip, Wake Leaf, and other publications. Originally from New England, she's a former bookseller and a 2021 A Public Space Writing Fellow. She's lived in New York City, Amsterdam, and Ithaca, New York. Heather Havrilesky writes the popular Ask Polly advice column on Substack and is the author of What If This Were Enough, How to Be a Person in the World, Disaster Preparedness, and most recently, Foreverland. She lives in Durham, North Carolina with her husband, 2 daughters, and 2 dogs. All right, thank you again. Remember, you can buy a copy of either book up at the front.
Over to you. Hello, welcome. I am thrilled to be here with you, Kate.
Likewise.
I read this book over the last 3 days. The blackout helped. And I loved it. Needless to say, it is extremely engrossing and great. And so I'm very, very, very excited to talk to you about it. I think I'll just start. I wanted to start with the one thing, but okay, so here's a strange story that we will begin with. We'll come back to it.
Okay.
Later. We'll come back to it later.
Yeah.
But so Kate wrote me an advice letter. I write an advice column called Ask Polly, and Kate wrote an advice letter to Polly asking her some advice. For some advice about a boyfriend and a problem she was having with her boyfriend. So I...
Women in the front row coached me through this period of my life.
So when Kate asked me to do this event, she said, I actually wrote you this advice letter once, and I was like, ooh, interesting. So then when I was looking for some information, a contact at Flyleaf, and I did a search on her name, and the advice letter, well, I was like, of course I won't know what letter it is. But then the advice letter was in my email box from 2014, which tells you a little bit about how much old emails spark joy in my life, because I hold on to them forever. And so I was like, I'm not going to read this yet, because I don't want to be prejudiced against the book based on whatever she writes in the letter. I should just go into it with a fresh, brain. And then towards the end of the book, I was like, what's going on here? And I read it, and so we will talk about that later. We will not. We'll pretend that I'm just a scholar and you're a scholar, and we're talking about important literature first. But we will return to that, I think. I asked for permission.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to talk about it. And I feel like it's also an important detail of the story that I panicked when she actually published it, because I just had this idea that I would just write it into the void and it would never be chosen, and then it just appeared one day on the internet. And I was like, oh my god, I haven't changed any identifying details. I wrote this panicked letter being like, can you take out like this?
And I saw that I didn't see that, and someone else had to help you take the details out, because I ignored it because I didn't. Whatever. I was like, I have 10 years of email right now, but I felt bad about that too, and I was like, I wonder if she's still angry at me.
You were back, and you were like, I see that someone else helped you, but I'm sorry that this happened. I was like, thank you so much.
So a lot of people write and they don't think about all the details. And so and sometimes I think like I'll just change some details, but then I think if I change Brian to John and his real name is John, and I already changed the detail, it gets messy. Anyway, and sometimes you don't want to tip someone off that you're going to publish their letter, because they will write back and say, no, thank you, I do not. I have changed my mind. I don't want you. And you're like, this is the best letter ever. I can't risk that. Okay, so one thing that I really love about your book, is the fact that I didn't know where it was going or what it was at first. It starts out very vague and abstract, and it slowly develops into more detail, like a Polaroid. And I found myself getting more and more into it as I read, which is rarely, I think, a feeling that you have when you're reading short stories. It's very hard to accomplish that kind of what is this? I don't even understand what this is. And to change and actually be more and more intrigued by it and more engaged. And I'm wondering, my first question to you is, was that a conscious effort on your part when you were organizing it? And if not, how did you think about how you were going to create? I mean, maybe it's just me.
Well,
but I wondered if that was intentional.
I put them in different orders like many, many times. But I think within the stories themselves, I was interested in like, not so much how a story happens, but how it like comes back to you and how it's like memory was kind of and like time were my initial interests, and just kind of rendering how memory lives in your mind and changes over time. So I think probably it's a product of that they sort of all begin with somebody, or many of them begin with somebody being kind of obsessed with something that they're so obsessed with that they know it like kind of by heart, and the details for the reader kind of fill in around that as it goes on.
Well, I thought it was a great way of building suspense. I was going to say the way you play with time and play with memory in each story is such a unifying sort of theme and vibe throughout the whole book. And I wondered if you ever, like, were there stories that you added that to after the fact, or do you just, is that like kind of did that become a way that you write about?
More just the way that I write.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm. And I think with stories, what's interesting is like you can kind of write just whatever feels kind of like it was very possible to like experiment, because I was just trying to write individual stories, and then like over time started to see what they had in common with each other, and so there's like a very organic way that it kind of evolved.
Yeah. Oh, that's cool.
Would it be helpful if I read one of them?
I was going to say, and I don't know what you want to read, but can I just say that I love that one where you say it was either this or that. I mean, it's almost that at the point where that comes along, it feels like such a almost a crescendo of memory and possibility in the book, which I thought was really smart and interesting.
I would love to read that one.
Oh, great. I mean, it stands alone well too.
Yeah,
that piece.
And actually, there's a fun story about how it came to be related to someone who's here tonight, so we can talk about that afterwards. This one is called "At the Time." At the time, I was living in Minnesota, or maybe New York. Liz and I were engaged and sharing a light-filled apartment with beautiful, tall windows, unless by then we weren't. I was 27 and Les 28. My subsequent girlfriend, Annie, expressed anger that I could not ever remember the chronology of how things unfolded, unless really she was angry that I loaded the dishwasher haphazardly and our drinking glasses kept cracking because of it. The glasses were patterned with small blue squares unless they were patterned with red ones. The glasses were Annie's unless they were Liz's, and Annie wanted them all thrown away. I wanted to throw them away, except that I wanted to keep them. I hated to throw things away, except that I loved it, the wild, unspooling, reckless release. Goodbye, unless please stay. Harbor, unless don't. The windows in the apartment Liz and I shared cast warm areas of light across our floors and our bed and the kitchen appliances, except when it rained. We could see Washington Square Park through our small bathroom window, unless our apartment was in Minnesota. The reason is obvious, or maybe it isn't. The Midwestern snow made the glass fog, unless it was just that we both closed our eyes. We cooked dinner unless it was takeout, Thai food unless sushi. We cleaned unless we forgot. We got along famously, except when we didn't, and slept in the same bed except when awake in the same bed. We ended things when she went back to Minnesota, or else, when things ended, I finally moved to New York. She kept the ring unless I did. I look at it every day, unless I can't stand to think of it at all. I married Liz subsequent to being engaged to her, except only in the sense that I played out in my mind how that would have been if I'd actually done it. And Annie and I ended things when I broke the last of those drinking glasses, unless it was when I said I forgot the chronology of whether I dated her before or after Liz. What do you mean, Annie said, unless she said nothing and looked like she hated me. I said, it's just what I feel, or else what I said was, I know it's impossible. We had a catastrophic fight at this point, bitter and noisy, except for the critical juncture when we were just quiet, both of us breathing. I held her unless I didn't. I told her to leave, except she left on her own. I smashed up the drinking glasses out in the street, except that I lined them all up in the window like chessmen, precisely, and with a kind of permanence. Afterward, I liked to watch the light play in the lines where they had fissured, unless the sun went down or I was doing something else that made me look the other way. There were 12 glasses altogether, unless there were 9 or 5 or 2. I regarded them while making breakfast, unless I was late to work and stopping for a pastry on my way instead. At the coffee shop near work, unless the one by my apartment, in the East Village, unless in St. Paul. I miss Minnesota except when I don't, and I regret New York always, unless never. I would change plenty of things, except that I wouldn't, and when I think about it that way, there is no what if, there is no then what. There is only what I chose and did not choose. So many open doors evaporating all around me, one after another, after another, after another.
So you have a story about that? That's really a good chapter.
It came out of a writing prompt, and the prompt was just to ask someone, where were you in blank year? And I think the month and year, and the month and year we all picked this was in the writing program, was May 2012. So I said to my friend Elisa, who's in the front row here, I said, where were you in May 2012? And she said, I don't remember if I lived in, she didn't remember if she had moved to New York City or was living with her parents in Minnesota that summer after college. And I just glommed onto that. You're just supposed to use something from whatever the response was, and I just was like, that's the not remembering felt really fruitful and interesting. And so yeah, she gave me a great seed to start with.
And was that one of the first things you wrote along the lines of, I'm not sure which thing happened first, or was it, did it come after? Because there are a lot of pieces in here. Did you become obsessed with that concept of memory? And I like how I give it a strong. Were you obsessed then? Were you fixated and stalking the idea of
I wrote this very early in the book, yes. Then I took it out of the book for a long time, and it went back in at the very end. People tend to have strong feelings about it, and people would either be like, it needs to be there, or they'd be like, get that out, it's weird. So yeah, I went in and out a few times, but I think that obsession existed even before I knew I was writing a book. I don't know. When I was in 8th grade, I had to write a graduation speech, and it was kind of about how time is so strange. Tomorrow we won't all be together. Today we are. I do think, I don't know, just am obsessed with that, yes.
Okay. Well, one of the things that's cool to me about all of the characters in your book is the fact that you do not shy away from their quirks, and there's a kind of, I would say there's a similarity between a lot of the protagonists.
Yeah.
In terms of, and this is part of the thing that kind of comes into focus, is the idea of this person who, it's almost like at first you don't understand why she won't accept life the way it is, or she won't get over things that are going wrong or feel wrong to her. Yeah. Even when there's this vague feeling what is wrong in her life? You don't go into the causes as much as the effects in a way. And then it's interesting because by the end of the book, you have this clearer and clearer sense of why this recurring kind of character, of course you have the recurring character of Helen. Yeah. But there are obviously similarities between different characters, but you start to see some of the causes of why you would become a person who would resist neat resolutions. And so if you could tell me a little bit about, was that again a conscious effort? Would you say that you avoid tying a neat little knot on things, and was that something you were toying with thematically?
Well, can I ask you first, when you say you start to see the reasons why a person might be feeling that way?
What do you mean?
No. I'm just interested. What? Yeah.
Well, okay. So you have there are these two siblings who are very cut and dry, and they're each in their own way. You've got the actor Evan, who is kind of glib.
Yeah.
And makes a joke of things.
Yeah.
That are heartfelt. And then you have Grace, who is, why would you bother thinking about that? You know, it's just like, and you know, I think at one point Evan says, you, I like this. I'm like, you know, you say to Grace, let's learn what fiction is, Heather. I am a nonfiction writer, so it's very hard for me to understand fiction.
I am aware that they have that feeling that people, so don't feel bad about that. But in grad school, people used to be like, what do you mean you don't have a brother? Yeah, I know that it feels that way, but I don't.
So you have a sister that's kind of like a brother to you. I get that. But there are all these scenes where everyone in the scene is telling the protagonist that she needs to move on.
Yeah.
The mother who Helen's mother, who appears several times, repeatedly says, "Who would focus on this?
Yeah.
Who has the luxury of feeling this sad?" You know, it was just like kind of a classic, honestly, Ask Polly letter writer thing that a mother says in an Ask Polly letter. And so and I write all the time. The more people ask you to do something, the less. I mean, if you grow up and people say get over it, you don't get over things.
Yes.
And so I wondered if, I really love how you depict those characters, because you depict them through the things they say. Mm-hmm. And we don't know that much else about them, although I love the story about the beach house being renovated.
Yeah. Well, I was going to talk about the story because that was one of the ones I wrote later, and I think this is kind of part of the answer to your question, is like, I did get really interested in the course of writing a story collection in the ways that like one story can inform another, and how it can like take you on this journey that is more thematic than plot, and things start to reflect on each other. So there's a story where the character is having this unease about one of her friends who's like maybe romantically interested in her, and she's trying to maintain some boundary, and she talks about like developing a fear that then goes with her through her life of becoming too close to someone too quickly. So then in the last story in the book, you can use that kind of sentiment again, and it kind of signals everything that happened in that other story without having to like do it all again. And in the case of the beach house story, I think like we've seen all these mothers who are quite cut and dry, like you're saying. And in one of the last stories, this mother is more explicit about what angers her about her family life and her sort of judgments against her children for what she didn't grow up with that they did. And my hope was that would kind of inform the way you understood like all the mothers up to that point in a way. I do think that was like an opportunity of a story collection I didn't really understand when I was starting to do it. Because then I was like a very new writer. I was just trying to figure out, I was like, a novel sounds intimidating, so I'll just write short things. And so the like opportunities of putting the stories in conversation with each other became very interesting as time went by. Yeah.
It feels very edited in a great way. A lot of books, as we know, do not feel edited at all. Those of us who like to read have noticed this. And your book is, I was amazed the deeper I got into it, how tight a lot of the, tight is not the word, but just how dense and delightful and concise and sort of meaningful it just felt like it almost felt like a great meal where things sort of, or like an orchestra where you, like a symphony where you keep hearing the same themes echoed back, but there's a development on the theme. And so with the protagonists throughout, they become more and more sympathetic as the book goes on, but also the antagonists are more sympathetic, which is kind of like a great TV series often takes that shape. You know? Did you have that in mind specifically? Did you work to get there? And I also wondered, I have so many questions. What was the editing process like once you found an editor? Did you do a lot of editing before you sold the book?
On some of them, yeah, because I wrote it over a very long time. Aside from the story that I finished first, that felt like done, and I was like, I'd like to write more stories. That was 2015, 15 and the book came out, so it's 8 years, yeah. I feel like it's such an opportunity with short stories that you can send them out to literary journals, and I had editors of those journals giving me notes, and so that was like, it was just a great education writing over those years, and then I went Algonquin. Well, my book was on submission for a long time, and then it's been 2 years since Algonquin bought the book, so I've had, in a good way, a lot of time to sit with all the little details, and and that my editor Betsy was amazing about, she was very I'm very particular about language, and she was very respectful of my like sort of final say on those things, but gave me these great kind of big certain big picture notes about kind of the symphony thing you're talking about, how to sort of but also sort of certain places be like, what if there was like more of what if there was a joke moment here, what if it like got a little lighter in this moment, so but I don't know, it's also kind of a mysterious process. It's a little hard to describe.
Well, I mean, I think the main thing that struck me is just that it coheres, and I think that's a really hard thing to pull off with a story collection. You don't even really expect it. You kind of just expect to read stories and say, well, they were all written by one person, so that's something. And I thought it was sort of brilliant the way it was put together. I will look at my actual questions and see if I have anything.
Say one more thing about what you said about an obsessive person. I think one thing I got interested in too in the course of writing this, at first I was just like, I'm just gonna sort of try to write something that feels true to life, and how like my experience of like what thinking can feel like and what remembering can feel like, and I got very interested in the ways that these women, many of them are young women, and how they're told like not to. People say to them, calm down. People say to them, can't you get over it? People say, let go. And I became very interested in that as like part of, in this case, young women's experiences, of the way that people tell them what they should or should not be worried about, and how disorienting that is. Really, I sort of like think that it's fine. I now at this point think it's fine that if she's obsessed with the scones, then she should care about whatever that feeling is that is really bothering her. And I think the ones who come to some greater self-awareness and understanding of the world like do let themselves like obsess about the thing that obsesses them until they come to some kind of clarity about it.
I think you capture the feeling really well of doubting what's good for you, doubting who you should know, doubting who you should align yourself with. A lot of the recurring feelings in the book are sort of like, it's this person, that often we're presented with this protagonist who's asking other people, how do I do this? How should I move forward? And people are saying, whatever, just be normal, which I think is relatable. And it doesn't work. I really love that about it. And I feel like it captures such a 20-something experience where you just don't know what you like necessarily yet. You're not sure what life is even going to be made of ever, you don't understand how other people do it. Now, did you, over the course of writing it, start to feel like, I want to write about people who are a little older than this? Because it seems like they're mostly around the same age, right, in the book?
Yeah. Towards the end, there are a few who are like more, they're partnered and they're thinking, and I do think of those narrators as like a little older, the ones who are like living with a boyfriend or talking about a relationship that lasts. A lot of, but they are all kind of.
But you're pretty young, so it makes sense that you're.
It only sort of came later that I sort of understood it as a book about your 20s, because I really was just trying to write about like remembering, but I do kind of write close to life, and I always have. And before I wrote fiction, as an undergraduate, I was writing a lot of essays, personal essays, and so I feel like I had gotten to this point where I was like, I don't want to write this close to life anymore. I feel kind of constricted, but I was still kind of starting from something real and then changing whatever I wanted to change. So it was an accident that they were all in their 20s. and then at a certain point, people started to be like, it's such a great episode in your 20s, which makes sense because I was that age. And I do now see how the extreme feelings of those years and how dire everything feels and how everything feels like a huge choice is like very reflected in this. But I did, then I wouldn't say that in this book I wanted to write about people who were older, but I did, when we were like sending out the book on submission, I started writing the beginning of a novel, and that novel was going to be about Helen, and because I felt like Helen and her siblings, like I was so interested in them, and I just felt like I could say more about them, and I really like I just feel like there's a lot of energy in them when they talk to each other, and I wrote a version, I kept working on that novel, and I felt really frustrated with it in a way, and for a while I was like, is this just because I don't understand novels, the way I understand short stories, like maybe if I just sort of keep at it, I'll figure it out, but eventually I realized like part of it was that I wasn't that age anymore, and I was trying to just like do the 20s angst, and so I was like, I think actually like when I first wrote about Helen, I like sort of gave her like, I had lost my best friend, she didn't want to be best friends anymore, and we were going apart, and I just kind of gave that problem to this character, and just gave her a few things that were bothering me a lot in my own life, and then a lot changed from there. I mean, it's not a true story by any means, but it started from something real, and so I was like, I think I have to, like, if I'm going to write about her again, I have to give her stuff that feels urgent now, because it's not. So then I did start like a new version of that novel that is about being in your 30s and about the stuff that comes up then.
Oh, everything comes back up.
Yeah.
Don't worry. Don't you worry. I really love the stuff about friendship, and at the sort of towards the end of the book, and I wondered what your thoughts on. I don't know. I guess I started to. It's so funny when you look at your own questions and you're like, all I see are just words that mean nothing. I never read I just write down questions, and I'm just like, no, that conversation is better without questions. I wondered what the heart of the friendship issue was for you, and if you ended up feeling like this character is putting something behind her for a good reason. Like she's finally learning to say goodbye, essentially. Like I couldn't quite tell what the kind of, I mean, of course it's not all just every story has a moral. What's the moral? But I wondered what you were toying with there with that friendship, and also with the boundary issues with the guy who writes on the girls' cast. I mean, I feel like there are kind of recurring trust issues and boundary issues that are sort of it's like you capture the sort of vague, trapped feeling of it in such a kind of Shirley Jackson suspenseful way, actually, and yet it's hard to tell it's almost like you want like a voiceover. You know what I mean? I mean, I love how it pulls you into this mood, but I just wondered, I was very curious where that came from and what was being resolved with that friendship. Like,
in the last story.
Yeah.
I think more than like, I guess I was interested in the way, and I think this is true in a different way with friendships between women, but like the less the answer and more the uncertainty, and in the case of the story, what else happened, like the conveying an experience, because like we have all these ideas about short stories that they have to resolve, and there needs to be like there's a conflict, then it resolves, or there's a change or a transformation, and I wanted it to like read like a short story, but be about a person who never gets resolution on a troubling memory. And because I think a lot of these stories, and like stories are still stories if you tell it to yourself over and over again because you don't understand it, and it just still troubles you in some way and you can't figure it out. And so that's what that story was kind of about. And it's about somebody who can't quite figure out, or like can't allow herself to name whatever troubled her, and therefore never quite gets to feel better about it.
Do you ever write stories where it resolves to a point and then you say, I don't like how this neatly wrapped itself up, or you don't do that?
No.
Yeah, that was my guess. Because I have more of like a compulsion to resolve.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Which matches nonfiction reasonably well, because people sort of expect that in nonfiction.
Yeah.
But it's interesting, it's interesting to think of having the opposite perspective, where you're just like, no, things don't resolve for me. I mean, I feel like that's one of the big feelings of the book is like, no, things they don't resolve. It's not neat. It's sort of like it's almost like a heartfelt defense of a lack of resolution.
Yeah, well, this feels related. Maybe it's not. We'll find out. But in the case of the friendships with women, like when I was first sort of writing some of those stories, people would often sort of say something to me in a writing workshop or whatever, like, is Helen in love with Catherine? I hope that's what is at stake here. And I was like, got really interested in like, well, why does that change? Like, why do you want to know?
Why is that better?
Why is it, like, it's almost like the question was like, well, it only matters if it's her friend and she lost her friend, that's like, she needs to grow up and get over it. Like,
yeah.
If she was in love with her friend, then that's literature and that's important. And she had an experience. And
there's
I feel like there's this pain of like when you're like having a feeling that the culture doesn't kind of endorse as like an important feeling, which I think is like a lot of them are obsessing about things because no one has told them it's okay to like feel something about it. So they're trying to like think a way to feel differently. But like its own heartbreak to like be like, she's just kind of going through a breakup, right? Like, I mean, I feel like the term friend breakup has like come more into the way we talk about friendships in the years since I first wrote that story. But it's like a breakup, and I was like, I'm less interested in like, was she or wasn't she, and more in like, why do you think that's like, what is that? What are you trying to figure out about whether the story matters or not? What does that mean about what this kind of narrator, like how much we let them even like how much we say to this kind of narrator, a young woman, like, does that really matter? Like, did something really, like, was it important? Like, and in the case of the friendships so I think in the case of these friendships with some of the men, it's like, I had a teacher in school who was like, his question about that story, we were just talking about what else happened. He was like, he kind of got to the end of it and he was like, am I supposed to think she was sexually assaulted? And I was like, why does that change? Like, if she felt really uncomfortable, and she doesn't know whether she had the right to feel uncomfortable, like, that's what it's about. It's about not knowing whether your feelings are like use of correct or not. And if you never get like a concrete enough thing that like if there's no concrete thing that you can be like, that's what happened, and what she has is just like, I felt weird about the way this person behaved toward me and how he like seemed to expect more and more of my time and energy and whatever. But she never kind of, all her life to this point that we know her, lets herself like sort of figures out how to, and that was a thing that happened that was like a profound emotional experience of her life.
Yeah. I mean, I think you do a really good job of making it. You do a beautiful job of making the menacing underbelly of those sensations apparent without leading us to believe that it necessarily is true that something specific happened or that the stakes. You tell us essentially, or show us, that the stakes are high for this person, which is almost like experimentally interesting. You know what I mean? It's boundary pushing because it's sort of like, whoa, what are we even really talking about? And the essence of the story is sort of like, well, it doesn't really matter what we're talking about actually, because the effects on the perception and the effects and the way that these things are metabolized is what matters. It's fascinating to think about trying to. I mean, did you run into trouble with? Did you go around in circles with this?
With that story?
Well, just with a lot of them, because it's a pretty like high level of difficulty to pull off, to kind of like take a woman's vague feelings that are very strong and dramatize them. I mean, I feel like I intuitively understood it and felt connected to it, and it was really beautifully done. But it's it must be difficult to kind of explain what trajectory you're on, you know, what you're trying to.
Well, that story was like the one that I remember when I was leaving my MFA, like my advisor was like, this story, that story with the broken arms and the vague feelings of dread. he was like, this one's done, like, send it out to these journals. I'll like tell my friends there to look out for it. And like, it's still like years later, like never landed any, it's in the book, but like even like in the run up to trying to publish the book, we're trying to place stories in places. We tried to get that one somewhere. Like, it's just something about it, maybe on its own, without the context of the rest of the book. Just like people are like, but nothing happens in the end. And it did take a while to figure out like what I feel like that story is one of the ones that changed more. Some of them kind of basically had the same shape overall, and that one I kept having to just like dial up and down like the tension and the dread and the sort of like spookier vibes.
Yeah. Well, there's a teacher in the book, right, that says characters always want something. Every character wants something.
Yeah.
Listen to me, really listen. Every character wants something.
Yeah.
And it's sort of like, the whole book feels like a little bit of a repudiation of that. And it's this sort of resistance of, life is not a Marvel movie, actually. We are not all just trying, I'm going to kick his ass. That is my motive. We are all sort of figuring out what it is we might want from moment to moment.
Yeah.
When you wrote nonfiction, what was that like? I mean, what did you like about nonfiction compared to fiction? What did you struggle with?
Well, I was in this. I feel like a lot of the use of like fragments juxtaposed and white space in the stories comes out of that program in those classes I took in those years, because it was like a lot of kind of like lyric essay, so very personal but very kind of poetic, and a lot of the momentum coming not out of like the plot but out of like the way things are placed together and the journey that takes you on. So I feel like at the micro level that like shows up in a lot of the stories, and also I think ultimately also is kind of the way that they are arranged together, all the stories. But I did at a certain point feel like I don't know. I was like 23 and I just was like, I don't know how much fidelity to like truth I want to have. I felt a little bored and frustrated, so I felt like not that much had happened. I don't know, I had like on a college campus, and then I had moved to New York. It's kind of like a lot of people have had like an experience like this, and I think it gave me more to play with and experiment with, to just be like, I'm gonna change things when they feel right to change them. I do think it ended up like getting me towards something more truthful emotionally when but I like do feel like they sort of like, I'm aware that they have this feeling of maybe it's real, that people do tend to like write like even sometimes like in the editorial process, like on the first story, like it would sort of instead of being like narrator says or she says, it would be like you say. I know that they feel that way, and I am like interested in the being in that gray area where people sort of wonder. I'm like fine with that, but and I think that having sort of done both and the sort of classes I was taking, the teacher was very interested in like how many different kinds of thing can be an essay, how broadly can we define the essay, how broadly can we define like truth, and so that kind of experimental approach I think stayed with me.
Did you do nonfiction in school? Was that your area of focus?
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
When I was undergraduate.
Yeah, it feels like the language feels like that it shows that kind of, But did you? Oh no, my phone is making noise really bad. It never makes noise. I hate it when it makes noise and the noise is off. What is that? Someone please fix my life. So I wonder if you, had a good question. No, I don't have my good question in my mind. I feel like okay, so having written this book, what parts of writing are the most sort of like, now I'm really having fun? And what parts are a slog for you? Like what aspects of
dialogue is really fun, especially like
they're really good at dialogue. Sorry, I'm acting like I'm your teacher. It's very bad. It's all the Ask Polly. If we hadn't met through Polly, it would be fun.
We gotta make sure we come back to that.
Yeah.
Dialogue is really fun, and I think those siblings kind of surprised me. I was trying to write about best friends, and I was just like, fill in what else is going on in Helen's life, because it's more from her point of view than it is from her point of view and not Catherine's. And then the siblings became like so important to the story, and it was such a good early lesson in like how you can surprise yourself by like sort of accidentally putting on the page just what you needed. And similarly, the story with the beach house with the twin sisters, like that sister is such a smart aleck, and that was really fun too. So dialogue is fun.
Yeah.
What's a slog? Plot is a slog.
Yeah.
But I find ways to sneak around it.
Yeah, I think I was intrigued by the ways you snuck around as a nonfiction writer who wants to break out of nonfiction. It's cool what you did, because you found a lot of ways to tell stories, and the thing that I think that sticks out the most for me is that there was an emotional trajectory to each piece, and that you definitely held yourself to high standards in terms of this is a very emotional. It's nothing felt. Just like we were looking at poignant, lovely view of the woods. Like, here, now look at the woods with me. It wasn't just description after description. It feels very propulsive and emotional. So I'm excited to read your novel that you told me before. Sorry, that you're working on a novel now, and it seems like it'll come naturally to you. I mean, it might even feel like a relief to not have to piece together this mosaic of, you know what I mean, and just have like a...
Well, I find that I miss the piecing together mosaic feeling a little bit, I feel a little... So I'm trying to find ways to do that in service of a novel instead of, because I think I had a version that I wrote and I threw it out and I started again. And I feel like just, the way things can speak across. I think I want each chapter to feel quite different from the one before. But then, they each make you realize something that you didn't. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Your standards are very high for yourself. Let's talk about that. I wish we had a couch. I mean, you're
so funny facing. I feel like I can't see it. I'm gonna face this way.
Do you think that you're easily bored with your own writing at times, and you just want it to stay exciting? Because I mean, the one sensation I had in reading your book was I was never a tiny bit bored, not a tiny bit. I mean, it was really a joy to read, and I think that it's rare that people write with such electricity, and I wonder. Do you find yourself no, this is boring, I need more? I mean, because you're not willing to impose plot and, you know what I mean? You're not willing to tie up loose ends in cute ways. Mm-hmm. You resist a lot of the things that people do to get them, the little candy that they make for themselves to resolve things. Uh-huh. You're you have very high standards. And so I just wonder, how hard is that? It seems hard. Maybe you're asking too much of yourself.
No, I mean, this novel was. I got feedback from the old version of the novel from reliable sources that it wasn't working, and I think it was because I was trying to do plotty novel things. I don't know. It just wasn't the same things that sort of inherently made me excited. What made this feel urgent in those stories. So I'm trying to figure out. I had to sort of figure out what felt important and necessary about writing these stories this way that I can transfer to a novel.
Yeah. Do you have an editor that you use outside of, say, Algonquin or do you have readers? Yeah. Do you have a writing group?
Well, yeah. I mean, I went to NYU and I made a lot of really good friends there who we still exchange work, and then some of us Then there's a period where some people left New York and some people stayed, and there was kind of a writing group for a while there. So yeah, I feel like I have a lot of people that I can share things with. Yeah.
That's great. That's great. Okay. Well, as far as how are we doing on time? Are we 10 more minutes? Okay. So maybe we'll ask a few questions. We'll get some people to ask questions. Is that okay? Or is that forbidden? Okay. We're allowed to do that. So we'll just talk about your Ask Polly letter. If you don't care. Okay. If you don't mind. If you don't care. As long as you don't care. So I read up until the last 3 chapters, and then I was like, okay, now I'm gonna read that letter, because I saw it in my inbox under her name, and I said, I shouldn't read that before I read the book. I should just enjoy the book, and with no prejudices or ideas about who this is. And then I went back and read the letter. At some point I thought, I feel like I know what the letter might be.
Really? Were you right?
Well, I was just sort of I I wonder if there's a lot of vague dissatisfaction in the letter, because so many of the, I mean, this has, you're an author, but obviously we write about things that are sort of like recurring frustrations in our life. I mean, ideally, one of the strengths of this collection to me is the way it feels so real. I mean, I feel like people often say to a fiction writer, it's you, of course it's you, when they believe the voice of the characters in the book, right? So it's very much a compliment. But the letter was sort of like, I have this problem and it won't go away with my boyfriend, and it was like, he moved away. You don't mind me telling what it's?
No, many people hear my story, so it all worked out.
It all worked out. And the funny thing is when I read it, I was like, I bet she's still with this guy because he sounds great. And in fact, the letter was sort of like, he moved away. I don't like how it happened. I can't quite get over it. We still have problems because of the way that he moved away, even though he's coming back and everything with us is fine. There were no other complaints about the guy besides, I don't really like how this went down.
Yeah, I didn't want to be long distance. Yeah.
Yeah. But it was sort of like, there was something, that you couldn't pinpoint about why it was bothering you so much.
And you kind of went right for like, there was a moment in the letter when you were like, I bet your childhood was like this. Like, this is what your childhood was like.
I was like, yeah, this is just,
yeah.
There is something here that just, it's like, you have this feeling of not being heard and listened to. And he did this one thing that felt like he wasn't listening to you. Even though he's made up for it in so many ways since, you're fixated on this one, which I related to. I mean, my childhood was like that too. So I was sort of like, but you can't just, if you're really going to stay with this guy, you can't stay in this state of just like, you're going to have so much bigger things to work through than this, was sort of my answer. Yeah. And when I read I read your letter and then I read my answer, I was like, okay, this is a good answer. Thank God. Because it was like 2014. It was like 9 years ago.
Yeah. It was a little later than that, I think.
We were both very young back then.
No, I had just met him. We weren't together in 2014, so it was later. It was maybe 2017.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, still, we were much younger. No, and I just said to you, but I didn't. At the time, I was like, this is such a frustrating answer. And then I read it again recently, and I was like, this was pretty smart.
And I think in my letter I say, I know you're not going to believe me, and you're not going to take. Yeah. Sometimes I say this, and when I read the response this time too, I thought, I bet she was defensive about this. Because I'm pretty harsh. I mean, it's like a harsh. I was a little bit upset when I read it because I thought, I have to do an event with this person. I was really kind of mean in my response. But I did think I was right. It's just a guess with advice. It really is just a guess. So it's like, ooh, was I right? Ooh. Anyway, it worked out. Thanks to me.
It was very good advice. It was. I did at the time. I was like, I wanted her to be like, "You're right. You should move back." You were totally right.
Sure.
And life is wild. Like then, so like I didn't want to live in the town where he had moved, and I did in the end move there. And we were like, we'll do this temporarily. And then the pandemic happened, and I came to really appreciate that.
Oh, you moved
I was there all the time. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is where he was. Yeah. That's right. And
you
liked
loved it there.
Oh my God.
Because, I don't know, I was very I got very immersed in it, and I got very attached. I get very attached. Yeah.
So you have an idea of what you should and shouldn't do. You are resistant to things.
Yes.
And then when you ground yourself in how you feel and your emotions in your body, and you're open and vulnerable, things could get better. You're very much in your head.
I think in my 20s, and I think for a lot of people, I knew that theoretically at the time. I just couldn't actually do it. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think that the contrast, the kind of war between head and heart is throughout this book, and it's relatable and it's interesting, So yeah. So it all worked out well. I mean, it was really amazing though to read this and then read the letter and say, it's just fascinating to see like someone who absolutely, I mean, I love letters like this. Someone who completely understands themselves, I mean, you really understood yourself at a young age, and yet it sort of like helped me get over this, or I'm not over this. You know, the subtext can be help me get over this, even though what you're saying is, get my back.
Yeah.
You know, tell me that it's okay that I'm not over this, and both things can be true at once. You know, but yeah, it's been a lovely journey. We've had a lovely journey together.
Yes, we have.
And I really can't wait for your novel. I'm sure it's gonna be great.
Thanks, Heather.
Does anyone have any questions for Kate? Has anyone had a chance to read the book yet? Yes. Okay, good. Does anyone have any questions that they've had a lot of time to think of questions? No?
Yes.
So this is just because of my own curiosity, because I've heard you answer a lot of questions. Are there questions that you feel really ready and open to answer, or like whether it's about the writing process or your personal life, because your work is so tied to who you are? And are there questions where you feel stumped, like you can't explain yourself?
I think it's pretty hard to like describe what I did an event a couple weeks ago where some of the questions, I mean, it was so fun, but some of the questions were like, how did you do this way? It was like kind of like, I don't know, it's like the writing process is mysterious and it's hard to like reconstruct how you did it. And then the lovely interviewer like doubled down and was like, no, but tell us how. I was like, I'm saying I don't know. So some of the process stuff is easier to answer and stuff is harder. Yeah. I don't really mind talking about like, I think people expect that a fiction writer doesn't want to talk about what's personal or like what came from life. I don't feel weird about that. I think because I used to write nonfiction before I wrote fiction, I feel pretty comfortable like talking about going between the two. Yeah.
When you do talk about stuff that has a connection to your personal life, do you find that it's cathartic for you? Would you say it's a therapeutic process, or is it a process that can have things bubble up that become problematic? Or
I think that like writing the stories was there are aspects of writing the stories that are therapeutic, just in terms of like getting to grips with your own thoughts about something or your own feelings about something, and like creating some kind of, not a resolution, but like something that's sort of like a container for that feeling.
Having some control.
Yeah. And I do think like I was like painfully nostalgic in the years when I started to write this. I feel like I have like sort of somehow changed my own relationship to time a little bit, or like to memory a little bit in a way that, but in terms of talking about it, I think what helps is I do kind of believe in that. I think a lot of writers feel like if I could just say it, I wouldn't have to write a story about it, kind of thing. And so it gives like a text where then I feel like I've been able to communicate something important that feels, in a way that then it's just like it's a starting point for a conversation, that to say something, to like start talking about something that would have been hard to say without the story in the first place, if that makes sense. Yes. Yeah.
I know that titles can be sort of a thorn in one's side, and I really, really love your title. And in asking this question, the answer can just be, I like it. But we've talked, or there's been discussion about sort of a through line, which in my mind, sort of the through line has been about a question of like loyalty around relationships and where this I character in the collection stands. And the title is kind of a very clear emotional statement.
Yeah.
That seems more honest than I meant it, right? Like I meant it might be something you can kind of take back or not, but I meant it once is very clear. It does have issues of memory and things like that, and rehashing things. So in any event, I was just wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit about the choice of the title, and if in a collection that is sort of dealing in irresolution, if there was some sort of thought about having a more resolute title, if that makes sense.
I wrote the title, like a lot of the titles even for the stories come out of like something that gets said somewhere in the text of that story, and so I had written this shorter story about the family, Helen and Evan and Grace, and Helen says Grace. Well, Helen gets in trouble because she has this letter that she wrote about I hate my sister, and she kept it, and Grace finds it, and then she's in trouble because she wrote a mean thing, and she's like, oh, I shouldn't be in trouble because I don't mean it anymore. I kept it because I meant it once. And then like pretty soon after writing that, I just like had to put a title on for like my master's, for graduation, like put a title on the thesis, and I remember just being like, oh, like that really fits. And I, at various points, considered changing it, and I'm glad that I hung on to it. I don't know. I also think I do also like, in terms of the way that the stories feel like very personal, like maybe they're, like how fictional are they? Like that having an I in the title, I also think is like a fun wink. It's kind of bending the fiction thing a little bit in an interesting way. Yeah. Okay. Were you gonna ask something else?
Oh yeah, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the cover and how the process.
Oh well, I had nothing to do with it except saying I love it. But I'll tell you what I love about it. I feel like it's like discrete things, so it sort of looks like it's sort of somehow visually is the idea of like a collection of things, right? They're like individual parts. And also, so quite literally, Helen is a barista. But I also think, I don't know for sure, that maybe the designer was doing like a tarot thing, because there's the story where there's a tarot reading, and so it's a 9 of Cups. And yeah, but I also just like emotionally love the Crush Cup. I think it's just so, yeah. Oh, yeah. It is beautiful. Yeah. Everybody, yeah, thank you so much.
Everyone fully satisfied.
Everyone fully.
Thank you so much for coming. Everyone